We're going to begin our lecture on Chapter 1 here discussing the exploration of life. So this is just a quick introduction. I'm not going to read that we'll just kind of skip through the introduction really quick. And we get here to discuss some of the big ideas that we'll cover in this chapter. So we need to understand that life can be defined by a group of properties common to all living organisms and is characterized by both a huge diversity of organisms as well as a hierarchy of organization. So as we know, the process of science is based on verifiable evidence, and in studying nature, scientists make observations, they form hypotheses, and they test their predictions. So some themes that run through all of biology are evolution, information, structure and function, energy and matter, and interactions. So the red panda, which is the picture on the cover of the textbook, and the one pictured also at the beginning of this chapter, it has a characteristic like kitten-like face, and they grow to be about the size of a large house cat. So these captivating creatures are well adapted for life in the mountainous forest of Asia. So their cinnamon red and white coat camouflages them with the red mosses and the white lichens of their environment, while their dark underbelly helps them hide from predators looking up from below. And their long bushy tail helps them balance in the trees, and when wrapped around their bodies, provides warmth as well during the winter. So several adaptations there that we're going to be talking about, but that's just to kind of give you an idea of what we talk about as we begin this chapter in defining biology. So we're going to consider the nature and the processes of science, and then we'll end the chapter with an exploration of 5 unifying themes that you'll find woven throughout your study of biology. So biology is the scientific study of life. And this obviously raises a question: what is life? So even if a small child realizes that an ant or a plant is alive, whereas a rock or a car is not, but the phenomenon we call life defines a basically a one-sentence definition. So we recognize life mainly by what living things do. So we get into the fact of defining life based on certain characteristics of living things. So as I said, biology is a scientific study of life. Properties of life include order, reproduction, growth and development, energy processing, regulation, response to the environment, and evolutionary adaptation. And the cell is the structural and functional unit of life. So we get into some photos here of, we're going to talk about the properties of life. So order, here in the first photo here, life is characterized by highly ordered structures. Then we get into reproduction. So organisms reproduce their own kind. Growth and development, so inherited information encoded in DNA controls the patterns of growth and development of all organisms. Response to the environment. All organisms respond to the environment stimuli. This Venus flytrap rapidly closed its trap in response to a fly landing on it. So that's just an example there. Energy processing. Organisms take in energy and use it to power all of their activities. Regulation. Organisms have regulatory mechanisms that maintain a beneficial internal environment. Sunbathing raises this lizard's body temperature on cold mornings, for example. And then evolutionary adaptation. Adaptations such as this red panda's warmth providing tail evolve over countless generations as individuals with heritable traits that are best suited to their environments have greater reproductive success. And these are just individual photos of what we just went over. So this was discussing how life is characterized by highly ordered structures. And then we have reproduction. Organisms reproduce their own kind, of course. And again, these are our properties defining life. And then growth and development. So inherited information encoded in DNA controls the pattern of growth and development of all organisms. And then here, response to the environment. This is just where we were showing this Venus flytrap rapidly closing in response to a fly landing on it, because they have a response to the environment, and that's another feature of life. And then evolutionary adaptation. So evolutionary adaptation is where we adapt to our environment. So checkpoint question says, how would you define life? So that again is the question as far as how you personally define it based on obviously the characteristics and properties that we've discussed in this chapter. So the next section, we discuss how biologists arrange the diversity of life into 3 domains. So diversity is a hallmark of life. One way in which biologists make sense of the vast array of organisms existing now and over the long history of life on Earth is to organize life's diversity into groups. Each unique form of life is called a species and is given a 2-part italicized scientific name. So this name identifies the genus and a particular species within that genus. For example, the name of our species is Homo sapiens, which means wise man. So biologists have so far identified and named about 1.8 million species. So estimates of the total number of species range from 10 million to more than 100 million. And there seems to be a human tendency to group things such as snakes or butterflies, although we recognize that each group includes many different species. And we often cluster groups into broader categories such as reptiles, which include snakes, and then insects, which include butterflies. So taxonomy is the branch of biology that names and classifies species, arranges species into a hierarchy of broader and broader groups from genus, family, order, class, and phylum to kingdom. So a goal of this classification system is to reflect the evolutionary history and relationships of organisms. So historically, biologists, they divided all of life into 5 kingdoms, but new methods for assessing evolutionary relationships, such as comparisons of DNA sequences, have led to an ongoing reevaluation of the number and boundaries of kingdoms. Although the debate continues on such divisions, there is a consensus among biologists that life can be organized into 3 higher levels called domains. So we're going to get into the 3 domains of life. We're going to get into talking about domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya, which includes, of course, protists, kingdom plantae, kingdom fungi, and kingdom animalia. So in this photo, this is, of course, our domain bacteria. So this is the bacteria. And this is your photo of the domain archaea. And the domains bacteria and archaea both consist of microscopic organisms with relatively simple cells. So you're probably most familiar with bacteria, which is a very diverse and widespread group. Many members of domain archaea live in Earth's extreme environments, such as salty lakes and boiling hot springs. And each rod-shaped or round structure in the photos of bacteria and archaea is a single cell. So these photos were made with an electron microscope, and the number along the side, of course, indicates the magnification. So that's kind of what that jumbled up word there on the side is. That's just the magnification of that image. Then we get into the domain eukarya for the next few photos. And we have protist, kingdom plantae, kingdom fungi, and kingdom animalia. So all the organisms with more complex cells are called eukaryotes and are grouped in the domain eukarya. So protists are a diverse collection of mostly single-celled organisms. So this photo shows an assortment of produce in a drop of pond water. So biologists continue to assess how to group the produce to reflect their evolutionary relationships. And then the three remaining groups within the eukarya are distinguished partly by their modes of nutrition. So we've got kingdom Plantae, which consists of plants, which produce their own food by photosynthesis. And the plant here pictured is a tropical plant, and it's, of course, native to the Americas. Kingdom fungi, represented by the mushrooms here in this photo, is a diverse group whose members mostly decompose organic waste and absorb the nutrients into their cells. Kingdom Animalia, so animals which are grouped in this kingdom obtain food by eating other organisms. So the butterfly here in this photo is drinking nectar from the thistle flower. So another way in which biologists make sense of the diversity and complexity of life is to organize it into a hierarchy of structural levels extending from the microscopic level of cells to the global scale of the entire Earth. So in the next section, we'll take more of a visual journey through all of these levels. And the checkpoint question here is, to which of the three domains of life do we belong? So this again is just a question for you just to kind of check your understanding of what we've went over to this point. Here in the next section, we talk about life's hierarchy of organization and new properties emerging at each level. So biologists study life across a very broad range of scales, from the molecules in a cell to the entire living planet. They divide this vast scope of biology into a series of structural levels. Follow the arrows that we're going to take on this next photo on the next slide, and we're going to go through this visual tour down the organizational hierarchy using this semi of a map to kind of see the different points, and so you can visualize the different levels. So biologists often focus their study of the natural world on one or a few of these levels that we're about to discuss, exploring individual components and interactions between those components, as well as connections to other levels. So we're going to discuss things such as emergent properties that result from the specific arrangement and interactions of component parts. For example, the arrangement and connections of nerve cells enables nervous signals to travel from a fish's brain to its tail, and movement is an emergent property arising from the interactions and interconnections of a fish's nervous, muscular, and skeletal systems. So here in this photo, we're going to go through each of these steps individually, going through and visualizing the pathway and the tour through the organizational hierarchy. So let me start here. I was trying to get the photo on the on the screen. So here we'll go through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 1 here is our biosphere. Now all life on Earth and the places where life exists is a biosphere. And you can see this is just an area in Florida, it shows. So these places include most regions of land, bodies of water, and the lower atmosphere. Then we get to ecosystem. Now, ecosystem is all the organisms in a particular area, as well as the physical components with which life interacts, such as soil, water, and light. So in this aerial view here of this ecosystem, you see a forest of trees kind of hugging the shoreline. So an emergent property of an ecosystem is the cycling of matter between organisms and the soil, water, and air. Then next you get to the community. The community is all the organisms in an ecosystem. So in this community, we find the mangrove trees and the eelgrass, crabs and barnacles, alligators and snakes, which is a huge diversity of insects, birds, and fish, and countless microorganisms in the photo. Then for a population, that is all the individuals of a particular species living in a community. So here this just shows schoolmaster snappers swimming together among the mangrove roots. We get next to an organism, and that's just an individual living thing. And then we move on to organs and organ systems, which this is showing a fish's nervous system consisting of its brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and body parts that perform a specific function here, making up this organ and organ system. So several organs may cooperate in an individual organ system. And then next you can see we add a tissue. A tissue is an organ such as the brain, and it is composed of several different tissues. So we have an example of an organ being the brain, and we just talked about organs and organ systems, and then of course the brain being an individual organ, makes up part of the nervous system. Now it takes many organs of course to make up an actual system, but then when we get to the tissue level, we then see a little bit of a closer view of how the different tissues are composed together to make an organ. So a tissue is a group of similar cells performing a specific function. Then you add number 8, which is the cell, the fundamental structural and functional unit of life. So the property of life emerges at the level of the cell. And then number 9 is the organelle. So here we're talking about the nucleus, which consists of the DNA, and the nucleus is an organelle that encloses a cell's DNA and its genetic instructions. So an organelle is a membrane enclosed functional structure in a cell. And then number 10, we add the molecule. Now here we, of course, consist of an atom, and a molecule is a chemical structure consisting of 2 or more units called atoms. So storing and transmitting hereditary information are properties that emerge from the arrangement of atoms in a molecule of DNA. So the checkpoint question here is, which of these levels of biological organization includes all of the others in the list? Cell, molecule, organ, tissue. And what would that be? So that's, again, checking your understanding and your comprehension of what we've went over at this point. We start the next section talking about what is science. So science is a way of knowing and approach to understanding the natural world, and it stems from our curiosity about ourselves and the world around us. So at the heart of science is inquiry, which is a search for information and explanations of natural phenomena. So biology, like other sciences, begins with careful observation. So in gathering information, biologists often use tools such as microscopes to extend their senses and precision instruments to facilitate careful measurement. Recorded observations are called data, and data is the evidence on which scientific inquiry is based. Some data might be qualitative, often in the form of recorded descriptions. For example, Jane Goodall spent decades recording her observations of chimpanzees' behavior during field research. So she also recorded volumes of quantitative data, such as the frequency and duration of specific behaviors. So quantitative data are generally numerical measurements, which may be organized into tables and graphs and analyzed with a type of mathematics called statistics. So observations often prompt us to ask questions and then seek answers by forming and testing hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a proposed explanation for a set of observations, and it leads to predictions that can be tested by making additional observations or by performing experiments. An experiment is a scientific test often carried out under controlled conditions. So we all use hypotheses and predictions in solving everyday problems. Let's say you are preparing for a big storm that is approaching your area and find that your flashlight isn't working. That your flashlight isn't working is an observation, and the question is obvious. Why doesn't it work? So here we're discovering two hypotheses, each of which leads to predictions that you can test. Predictions are the results we should expect if the hypothesis is correct, and they often take an if or then form. For example, if the dead battery hypothesis is correct, then replacing the batteries with new ones will fix the problem. So in this photo here, we see an everyday example of forming and testing hypotheses. So we can see here how the observation leads to a question, and then you have hypothesis 1 or hypothesis 2 leading to a prediction, a test of the prediction, and then the results. So an important point about scientific inquiry is that we can never prove that a hypothesis is true. So the main thing is that we could test our hypothesis by carefully going through different steps that you might want to take to test it. But testing hypothesis in various ways proves additional support and increases our confidence in the hypothesis. So in this photo here, you just see several examples of how a hypothesis actually works. The checkpoint question is, what is the main requirement for a scientific hypothesis? In this next section, we discuss hypotheses and how they can be tested using controlled experiments. So, in an experimental test of a hypothesis, a researcher often manipulates one component in a system and observes the effects of this change. So, variables are factors that vary in an experiment. The factor that is manipulated by the researchers is called the independent variable. The measure used to judge the outcome of the experiment is called the dependent variable. And this variable depends on or is affected by the manipulated variable. So a controlled experiment is one in which an experimental group is compared with a control group. And these groups ideally differ only in the one variable the experiment is designed to test. The use of control in experimental groups can demonstrate the effect of a single variable. For example, researchers found that mice models that did not match their habitat had higher predation rates than camouflaged models. Hypothesis can be tested in humans with clinical trials as well as retrospective and prospective observational studies. So this photo here of the beach population and the inland population. The beach population, this is a beach mouse, and this living on a sparsely vegetated sand dunes. Then you've got the members of the same species living about 30 kilometers inland in an inland population. So this experiment is an example of a field study, one not done in a laboratory but out in nature, using the natural habitat of the mice and their predators. The researchers built 250 plastic models of mice and painted them to resemble either beach or inland mice. Equal numbers of models were placed randomly in both habitats. So the models resembling the native mice in each habitat were the control group. The mice with the non-native coloration were the experimental group. So signs of predation were recorded for 3 days. And as a result, they calculated and gathered data in this experiment to see the results of the camouflaged experiment. And here is the data that was collected, and you can see here as far as the number of attacks that they recorded based on their habitat. So we can see here that controlled experiments involving humans, such as tests of new medications, are called clinical trials or clinical studies. So subjects are usually randomly assigned to control an experimental group. So the control group participants are often given like a placebo, which is a treatment such as a sugar pill that doesn't contain the substance being studied. And in a double-blind trial, neither the researchers nor the subjects know who is in which group. So clinical trials must be cut short if preliminary results show that the treatment is either significantly harmful or significantly beneficial to the participants, because it would be unethical to knowingly harm participants or withhold effective treatment. So your checkpoint question for this section is, in some studies, researchers try to match factors such as sex, age, and general health for subjects in the control and experimental groups. What is this experimental design trying to do? So controlled experiments are not the only way to test hypotheses. Scientists often use data from observations to form and test hypotheses. So let's consider an example of how scientists have answered the question of how to classify the red panda. So as you will see, the red panda story provides an excellent example of observations leading to hypothesis and the willingness of scientists to revise hypotheses to incorporate new evidence. So, based on observations of physical similarities, scientists initially hypothesized that the red panda was most closely related to raccoons. Other scientists, observing that the diet and habitat of red pandas were similar to those of giant pandas, placed the two pandas together in their own family. But recent studies comparing DNA sequences led scientists to classify red pandas as the only living species of their family. So here in this photo, should red pandas be grouped with either raccoons or giant pandas? So in recent years, scientists have increasingly used molecular evidence based on comparisons of DNA sequences to test hypotheses about evolutionary relationships. The underlying assumption is that the more closely the DNA sequences of two species match, the more closely they are related. So a number of recently published molecular studies strongly support the hypothesis that red pandas are not part of either the bear or the raccoon family. As a result of this new evidence of differences in the DNA sequences of these groups, scientists now classify red pandas as the sole living species of their own family. And your checkpoint questions explain why comparisons of DNA sequences are considered observational and not experimental data. So as discussed previously, scientists use a process of inquiry that includes making observations, asking questions, forming hypotheses, and testing them. So very few scientific inquiries, however, adhere rigidly to the sequence of steps that are typically used to describe the scientific method. So we're about to discuss a more inclusive model of the scientific process. So you can see that forming and testing hypotheses are at the center of the science. So here in this photo, formation and testing of the hypotheses is in the center core. So the core set of activities is the reason that science does so well in explaining natural phenomena. These activities, however, are shaped by exploration and discovery and influenced by interactions with other scientists and with society more generally. So the arrows pointing between the circles illustrates that the components of the scientific process interact and interconnect. So here, this is a more realistic model of the process of science. This illustration is based on a model, and we can see here the overview of the process of science and how it is actually working. So the process of science is typically repetitive and non-linear. So for example, scientists often work through several iterations of making observations and asking questions, with each round informing the next, before setting on hypotheses that they wish to test. So in fine-tuning their questions, biologists rely heavily on scientific literature, the published contributions of fellow scientists or their peers. So by reading about and understanding past studies, scientists can build on the foundation of existing knowledge. So why is hypothesis testing at the center of the process of science? So here, the goal of science is to understand natural phenomena. So the goal of technology is to apply scientific knowledge for some specific purpose. So many of the current issues facing society are related to biology, and they often involve our expanding technology. So what are the differences between science and technology? Well, the goal of science is to understand natural phenomena. In contrast, the goal of technology is to apply scientific knowledge for some specific purpose. So scientists usually speak of discoveries, whereas engineers more often speak of inventions. These two fields, however, are interdependent. Scientists use new technology in their research, and scientific discoveries often lead to the development of new technologies. So the potent combination of science and technology can have dramatic effects on society. For example, the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick more than 60 years ago was aided by the technology of X-ray. Subsequent advances in DNA science have led to the technologies of DNA manipulation that today are transforming applied fields such as medicine, agriculture, and forensics. So technology has improved our standard of living in many ways, but not without consequences. So technology has helped Earth's population to grow tenfold in the past 3 centuries and to more than double in just the past 40 years. So there are now more than 7.3 billion people on Earth. So the process of science we have just explored discusses the results in new biological discoveries every day. So we're going to go into broader themes in the study of biology. So we have 5 unifying themes in biology. Life is distinguished by its unity and diversity. The scientific explanation for this unity and diversity is evolution, so the process of change that has transformed life on Earth from its earliest forms to the vast array of organisms living today. So biology is the subject of enormous scope. Within this ever-growing body of knowledge, however, we can identify some unifying themes. So the theme of evolution is the core theme of biology. So life is distinguished by both its unity and its diversity. Multiple lines of evidence point to life's unity, from the similarities seen among and between fossil and living organisms to common metabolic processes, to the universal molecule of inheritance, DNA. The amazing diversity of life is on display all around you and is documented in zoos, nature shows, and natural history museums. So the scientific explanation for this unity and diversity, of course, is evolution, which is the process of change that has transformed life on Earth from its earliest forms to the vast array of organisms living today. So Darwin's theory of evolution discusses the history of life as documented by fossils and other evidence. And it is the saga of a changing Earth billions of years old, inhabited by an evolving cast of living forms. This evolutionary view of life came into sharp focus in 1859 when Charles Darwin published one of the most influential books ever written, entitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So we get into this photo here of the unity and diversity among birds. And this diagram illustrates the unity and diversity. So the flamingo, penguin, and hummingbird all have a common bird body plan of wings, beak, feet, and feathers, but these structures are highly specialized for each bird's unique lifestyle. So Darwin synthesized the theory of evolution by natural selection. So you can see here on the left the observations being heritable variations and overproduction of offspring, and the inferences being natural selection, which is what evolution is based on. Unequal reproductive success leads to evolution of adaptations in populations. So in this diagram here, these next few diagrams use a simple example to show how natural selection works. So this first photo here is an imaginary beetle population that has colonized an area where the soil has been blackened by a recent brush fire. Initially, the population varies extensively in the inherited coloration of individuals from very light gray to charcoal. Secondly, a bird eats the beetles it sees most easily, so the light-colored ones. This selective predation reduces the number of light-colored beetles and favors the survival and reproductive success of the darker beetles, which pass on the genes for dark coloration to their offspring. And then third, after several generations, the population is quite different from the original one. As a result of natural selection, the frequency of the darker colored beetles in the population has increased. So each species on Earth today has a family history. A species represents one twig on a branching tree of life that extends back in time through ancestral species more and more remote. So just as you have a family tree, each species on Earth today has a family history. A species represents one twig on a branching tree of life that extends back in time through ancestral species more and more remote. For example, the fossil record indicates that red pandas, raccoons, and weasels share an ancestor that existed close to 30 million years ago. Tracing back farther in time, these groups and bears share a common ancestor that lived about 40 million years ago. All mammals have hair and milk producing mammary glands, and such similarities are what we would expect if all mammals descended from a common ancestor. Evidence indicates that the ancestral mammal arose more than 200 million years ago. So in this photo here traces some of the family tree of the red panda based on the most recent molecular evidence. So diagrams of evolutionary relationships generally take the form of branching trees, usually turned sideways and read from left to right. So you can see that the giant pandas, red pandas, and raccoons are placed in three separate families. Red pandas are now classified as the sole living species of a separate family. The theory of evolution by natural selection is supported by multiple lines of evidence: the fossil record, experiments, observations of natural selection in action, and ever-increasing numbers of DNA comparisons. Evolution is the central theme that makes sense of everything we know and learn about biology. So throughout this study, we're going to see many more examples of both the processes and products of evolution. So you just learned that natural selection is the primary mechanism of evolution in which the environment selects for adaptive traits when organisms with such traits are better able to survive and reproduce. Through the selective breeding of plants and animals, humans also act as agents of evolution. So as a result of artificial selection, our crops, livestock, and pets bear little resemblance to their wild ancestors. Humans have been modifying species for millennia by choosing which organisms reproduce, and recent advances in biotechnology have increased our capabilities. Plant biologists can now identify genes for beneficial traits in relatives of our crop plants or even in totally unrelated species, and then use genetic engineering to produce enhanced crops. For example, genes for such traits as drought tolerance, improved growth, and increased nutrition have been introduced into rice plants. But humans also affect evolution unintentionally. The impact of habitat loss and climate change can be seen in the loss of species. Indeed, scientists estimate that the current rate of extinction is 100 to 1,000 times the typical rate seen in the fossil record. Our actions are also driving evolutionary changes in species. For example, our widespread use of antibiotics and pesticides has led to the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria and pesticide resistance in insects. The processes of life, such as reproduction, growth and development, internal regulation, and response to the environment, all depend on the transmission and use of information. Genetic information encoded in DNA determines an organism's structure and functions, but such properties also depend on the stimuli, signals, and pathways that regulate where, when, and how an organism's genetic information is expressed. Indeed, the integrated flow of genetic and other types of information is essential for life. So DNA provides the master instructions for all of the cell's function. It also has the heritable information that is passed from one generation to the next. So how does molecular structure of DNA account for its ability to encode and transmit information? Well, each DNA molecule is made up of two long chains called strands, coiled together into a double helix. The strands are made up of four kinds of chemical building blocks called nucleotides. And this structure illustrates these four nucleotides with different colors and letter abbreviations of their names. The right side of the figure shows a short section of a DNA double helix. So before a cell divides, its DNA is first replicated or copied. The two strands, so-called unzip, and new complementary strands assemble along the separated strands so that the information in the two resulting sets of DNA remains the same. Thus, each new cell inherits a complete set of DNA that is identical to that of the parent cell. So you began as a single cell stocked with DNA inherited from your two parents. Each round of cell division transmitted copies of that DNA to what eventually became the trillions of cells in your body. So the way DNA encodes a cell's information is analogous to the way we arrange letters on the alphabet into precise sequence with specific meanings. So the word rat, R-A-T, for example, conjures up an image, imaginatory animal of a rodent, which contain, of course, the same letters, but now you can use those same letters and spell art, A-R-T, and that means something totally different. So we can think of the four nucleotides as the alphabet of inheritance. Specific sequences of these four chemical letters encode precise information in units of inheritance called genes, which are typically hundreds or thousands of letters long. For most genes, the sequence provides the blueprint for making a protein, and proteins are the major players in building and maintaining the cell and carrying out its activities. So making a protein from the instructions contained in a gene involves a sequential flow of information. So making a protein from the instructions contained in a gene involves a sequential flow of information, which is illustrated here in this photo. A gene's information is first transcribed from DNA to an intermediate molecule, RNA. So an RNA molecule carries the information to the protein manufacturing machinery in the cell. There, the sequence of nucleotides in the RNA is translated into a chain of protein building blocks. So once completed, the chain forms a specific protein with a unique shape and function, and this process is called gene expression. So all forms of life use essentially the same chemical language to translate the information stored in DNA into proteins. Called the genetic code, this universal language is a strong piece of evidence that all living organisms are related. The universal genetic code also makes it possible to engineer cells to produce proteins normally found only in some other organism. Thus, bacteria can be used to produce insulin for the treatment of diabetes by inserting a gene for human insulin into bacterial cells. So this photo illustrates the importance of the flow of information in controlling the level of sugar in your body. So all body cells have the same genetic information, but the gene for insulin is only expressed in certain cells in your pancreas. What signals tell those cells to produce and release insulin? Well, one, after a meal, the level of sugar glucose in your blood rises. Number two, this internal signal stimulates cells in your pancreas to secrete the hormone insulin, which travels throughout your body and your blood. And then number three, insulin binds to receptors on body cells, causing them to take up glucose. And then number four, the now lowered blood glucose level removes the signal and insulin secretion decreases. So information flow through such regulatory systems enables organisms to maintain relative, stable, and beneficial internal conditions. So receiving and relaying information is evident at all levels of biological organization. A third theme in biology that pervades all of biology is the correlation of structure and function. So when considering useful objects around your home, you may note that form generally fits function. A screwdriver tightens or loosens screws. A hammer pounds nails. So because of their form, these tools can't do each other's jobs. You use a spoon to eat soup, but if you're spearing a piece of meat, you will want to use a fork. So similarly, in biological systems, structure, meaning the shape of something, and function, meaning what it does, are almost always related, with each providing insight into the other. So the relationship between structure and function can be observed at every level of life. At the molecular level, the structure of a protein correlates with its function. whether it is part of a strong ligament holding your bones together or the hemoglobin molecules transporting oxygen in your blood. On the cellular level, the long extensions of nerve cells enable them to transmit impulses from your spinal cord to your toes. The long, thin cells of fungi enable them to extend through their food source and absorb nutrients. And the thick walls surrounding plant cells provide structural support to the plant. So in this photo, we see the thick walls surrounding plant cells providing structural support to the plant leaf pictured here, just as the tough exoskeleton of the beetle supports its body. So this is structural adaptations in the form of plant cell walls and insect exoskeletons that function in physical support. So let's consider the red panda's hand as another example. So here in this photo, you can see a red panda holding some bamboo. Scientists using an X-ray technique known as a CT produces a scan of the hand and wrist of the red panda, upper left part of the figure that you can see there, to highlight the small bone protruding from the wrist called the radial sesamoid. In red pandas, this bone is much larger than in related animals and is often referred to as a false thumb. What might be its function? Well, just as your thumbs are useful in grasping objects, the red panda's wrist projection helps it grasp bamboo. By studying the fossil record, scientists propose that this projection originally evolved in the red panda's carnivorous ancestor as an adaptation that enabled it to move along branches in trees. Secondarily, this projection enabled the plant-eating red panda to hold on to bamboo. In the evolutionary history of life, we will encounter many examples of the remodeling of existing structures to new functions. So the activities of life, meaning movement, growth, reproduction, regulation, and most cellular processes require energy. The input of energy primarily from the sun and the conversion of energy from one form to take another makes life possible. So energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction, entering as sunlight, converted to chemical energy by producers, passed on to consumers, and then exiting as heat. Ecosystems are characterized by the cycling of matter from the atmosphere and soil through producers, consumers, and decomposers, then back to the environment. So in this photo here, we see a simplified diagram of the transfer and transformations of energy and matter taking place in a forest. So plants are the producers that produce the food for a typical terrestrial ecosystem. A tree, for example, absorbs water and minerals through its roots, and the leaves take in carbon dioxide from the air. In the process of photosynthesis, energy from sunlight is stored as chemical energy as the atoms in CO2 and water are rearranged into sugar molecules that are rich in chemical energy. So we can see here the consumers in an ecosystem eat plants and other animals. So the moose here in this photo eats the grasses and tender shoots and leaves of trees in the forest ecosystem. To release the chemical energy in food, animals as well as plants and most other organisms use the process of cellular respiration, taking in oxygen from the air and releasing carbon dioxide. Consumers use both the energy and the atoms of matter obtained from food to build new molecules. For example, proteins in the moose's fur were assembled from atoms that were once in its food, and animals' waste returns matter to the environment. So a vital part of this ecosystem are the small animals, fungi, and bacteria in the soil that decompose waste and the remains of dead organisms. These decomposers act as recyclers, changing complex matter into simpler chemicals that return to the environment and are once again available to producers. So as we just saw, the study of life extends from the microscopic scale of the molecules and cells that make up an organism to the global scale of the entire living planet. Working our way upward through this hierarchy, we noted that novel properties arise at each higher level. Such emergent properties represent an important concept in biology. The familiar saying that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts captures this idea. The emergent properties of each level result from the specific arrangement and interactions of its parts. So such a combination of components forms a more complex organization called a system. Biological systems can range from the molecular machinery of a cell to the functioning of an ecosystem or an entire biosphere. So your body is a system, and it is the interactions between the parts, meaning molecules, cells, tissues, and organs, that allow you to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. Interactions and connections between your circulatory, digestive, and endocrine hormonal systems, your blood, pancreatic cells, molecules of insulin, and body cells enable the regulation of blood glucose level. So an alteration in one of the components of such a system disrupts its functioning and can lead to disease. So using an approach called systems biology, scientists attempt to model the behavior of biological systems by analyzing the interactions among their parts. So life is characterized by interconnections and interactions. So here's a checkpoint question. A box of bicycle parts won't do anything, but if the parts are properly assembled, you can take a ride. What does this illustrate? So here in this photo here, we see life being characterized by interconnections and interactions. So consider this sloth here in this photo in this rainforest, and it is sporting a luxuriant growth of photosynthetic bacteria, the greenish tinge in its hair. The sloth depends on trees for food and shelter. The tree uses nutrients from the decomposition of the sloth's feces. The bacteria gain access to the sunlight necessary for photosynthesis by living on the sloth, and the sloth is camouflaged from predators by its greenish-brown coat. We can find these types of interactions among component parts at every level of biological organization. To help you recognize the theme of system interactions and interconnections in this text, some examples will be identified in this presentation. So the next several slides are basically a review of the concepts that we've learned throughout this chapter.